Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today is July 1st, and it's the anniversary of two significant events in the history of warfare just in the last 200 years. One is the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863 in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which in and of itself, just one of the 3 days of battle, was incredibly bloody and saw something in the neighborhood of 10 to 20,000 casualties combined between both sides. It's also the first day of the Battle of the Somme, which actually went on for about 4.5 months. But on that first day, the British Empire saw nearly 20,000 killed and something like 60,000 overall casualties, killed, wounded, missing, just among the 120,000 or so who took part in that attack in just a span of a few hours. But that was not the bloodiest day of the First World War, despite what a lot of people think. So I thought we would take a look today at our friends over at the channel The Great War, who have a video on this topic. It's called The Deadliest Day of World War I, and I'm really curious to see what they have to say about this, because I believe the general understanding, at least historically, has been that the deadliest day for any one army during the First World War was in August of 1914, and it was for the French at the Battle of the Frontiers, with something like 27,000 killed in a single day. But that's been challenged. I've seen some sources saying maybe it wasn't that bad, and these are all estimates and things like that. And comparatively speaking, as an American, I believe the deadliest day for Americans in World War I was something like 400 killed in October of 1918 during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Deadliest day in the history of the United States in warfare is September 17th, 1862, at the Battle of Antietam, which saw less than 4,000 killed on both sides combined. So comparatively speaking, we're talking about 5, 6, 7 times that number. So I'm curious to see what they talk about here. I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. I also want to invite you to check out my YouTube channel, The Stories of the Great War, which the link's in the description, as well as my podcast on the same topic, Stories of the Great War. Links are down below, but you can check the podcast out as well as Stories of the Civil War anywhere that you get your podcasts. That's a lot, I know. Let's dive in.
The First World War lasted 4 years and claimed the lives of some 10 million soldiers. But what was the single deadliest day of the Great War?
And it's important to note, too, that it also claimed the lives of millions of civilians on top of that. So the numbers we're looking at are somewhere around 10 to 20 million when you include all the civilians.
Answer might come as a surprise and a useful reminder. From 1914 to 1918 in Europe, Africa, Asia, and on the high seas, the Great War claimed the lives of around 10 million soldiers from dozens of nations. That's about 6,700 lives lost every single day for more than 1,500 days.
That's insane to me when you put it in that perspective. Over 6,000 every single day. That's almost double the deadliest day in the history of American warfare every single day for 4 years. That's nuts. That's from some perspective. And then you go to World War II, and it's even more deadly over a slightly longer period of time.
But of course, not every day was the same. In any given 24-hour period, a section of the front might be very quiet, or the fighting might rage so fiercely that tens of thousands were killed in just a few hours. Some infamous dates stand out in popular history books and for history buffs. The first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the peak of the fighting in the Battle of the Frontiers in 1914.
And just for perspective, the Battle of the Frontiers, you're talking about the very beginning stages of the war. This is the first few weeks of the war. And this is when the French are actually launching an attack of their own while the Germans are swinging around on the northern end of the Western Front. The French, more in kind of the central to southern end of the Western Front, are launching their own attack.
Or the start of the German Spring Offensive in 1918. But do we know what was the single bloodiest day of the war, or can we know? The best answers we have lie in the casualty records left in the archives by the armies from each belligerent state. After a battle, each unit would report on how many soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, and these reports would then be tabulated by staff officers to keep track of overall losses and fighting power.
And that there, I believe, that looks, almost positive, that is Tyncott Cemetery outside of Ypres, Belgium, which is the largest British Commonwealth war cemetery in the world.
But often these records are incomplete, inaccurate, or combine several days' losses together. And since each country's army kept its own records, and sometimes these records are not easy to compare or have since been lost, like when the German archives were destroyed in 1945, or when many Russian records were lost after the revolution.
Right, that's a great point, because there's just, you would think 100 years ago, we've got to have detailed records of this stuff, right? But the fact is we just don't, and that's why so much of this is an estimate. We have very specific numbers, like for the British Army at the Somme, but those are usually the exception rather than the rule.
The data we have doesn't let us say which day was bloodiest for all armies combined. Right. But what we can do is focus on which day was the deadliest for one single country. And it turns out, recent findings have upended conventional wisdom. So let's start with one of the most infamous days of the Great War, July 1st, 1916. Britain had a small army when the war began, but by 1916, it was ready to launch its first major offensive at the Battle of the Somme.
And it was the first major offensive with what they called the New Army, or Kitchener's Army. This is the volunteer army. These are the guys that were called up after the war began and were trained and then shipped over, and this was their first chance to really see what they could do. The original, the professional army that they started the war with, which is like 100,000 or 200,000 total worldwide, most of them are pretty well wiped out in the first months of the war in and around the Ypres salient. They called them the Old Contemptibles.
The British Army suffered some costly days in the Great War, like at Passchendaele, Ypres, or in the German offensive of 1918. But worst of all was July 1st, 1916. By mid-1916, Britain's new volunteer armies had been trained and sent to the front lines in France and Belgium. It had taken time to build up military strength, and the French had been doing the bulk of the fighting since 1914. Now was Britain's moment to take its share of the load and contribute to an offensive on either side of the Somme River alongside the French army.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about why the Somme was chosen and what the timing was all about and all of those sorts of things. Other videos you can check out that I've done about the Somme.
But not everything went according to plan. The German offensive at Verdun put the French under such pressure that the British had to take on a larger role in the attack. The British
didn't want to attack at the Somme. They wanted to launch an offensive at Ypres, which is what they did a year later with Passchendaele. It starts with Messines Ridge and then eventually Passchendaele.
Hoped that they could rely on artillery to win. If their unprecedented weight of artillery fire could smash the German trenches and dugouts before the infantry went over the top, victory would be assured. British troops trained to advance at a steady pace across no man's land, since it was expected that most German defenses would already be destroyed.
Yeah, and I'm going back to the Somme in September, and going to be doing a lot of videos from the German perspective while I'm there this time. And a lot of the German stories of the Somme do describe that they had no sooner come out of their dugouts, which were sometimes 20, 30 feet below, because the Germans had been here for 2 years in this spot. They were well dug in. When the bombardment happened every day for a week, they just went down in their dugouts. Yes, it messed up their trenches. Yes, it messed up some of their defenses, but they were okay. But a lot of them describe that no sooner have they come out of their dugouts and gotten into position than the British were on them.
For a week, the British guns pounded German positions and turned the landscape into a mass of shell holes and broken trenches. On July 1st, 1916, Britain's new army went over the top, but the German defenses were mostly intact. Many of the British shells had been duds, and German bunkers had protected many of their men from the shelling. As the British advanced steadily across no man's land, the Germans were able to come up into their trenches and put their machine guns to work with deadly results. And
they didn't just have a few machine guns. They had what were called interlocking bands of machine gun fire. So at any given point, you had every spot on the battlefield could be covered by at least one, probably multiple machine guns.
Were broken up and stopped before even reaching the German trenches. Other British units managed to penetrate into the German lines, but were then stuck in exposed positions and couldn't communicate with their commanders back on the British side. A Scottish soldier remembered the hours after the failed advance. We began to work our way towards the communication trench, but owing to the lie of the ground...
Communication trenches are, you have multiple lines of trenches. You have a front line trench, you have reserve trenches, and those sorts of things. And in between the lines of defenses, you have communication trenches, which will allow you to move between them.
Badly exposed, and I, at length, found myself the only living occupant of that corner. I found my platoon officer, Lieutenant McBrain, lying shot through the head. Of the others of my platoon, I could get no news, except those I saw lying dead or wounded. The British did make some limited gains that day, but not as much as the French did on their part of the battlefield, and at a much higher cost. July 1st, 1916 was Britain's deadliest day not just in the First World War, but in all of British military history. 19,240 men were killed and about 38,000 wounded. The Battle of the Somme went on for more than 4 months, but no day was as costly to the British as the first. That's part of the reason why the Somme and July 1916 have had such an important influence on British memory of the war. There have been countless books, films, and television series, and thousands of Britons still visit the battlefield every year.
Yeah, and if you go to places like the Newfoundland Memorial Park at Beaumont Hamel, which is on the Somme battlefield, probably the best preserved spot on the Somme battlefield, there you learn the story of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, who Newfoundland was not a part of Canada at that time. It was a separate British dominion, and their battalion suffered so horribly that July 1st is kind of their Memorial Day because of what happened there.
That said, July 1st on the Somme was not the bloodiest day of the war for a single army. For the British dominions, by the way, Newfoundland had its worst day of the war on July 1st as well, losing 85% of its men killed or wounded.
And I did a video there. Recommend you check it out or watch anybody's video from Beaumont Hamel. It's one of the most powerful historic spots I've ever visited in my life. It's really quite overwhelming.
The Australians suffered their most intense losses on July 19, 1916, at Fromelles, with 2,000 dead from a single division. For Canada, it was the 2,000...
Yeah, people talk all the time about the Anzacs at Gallipoli, and Gallipoli was horrible. But the Somme was the worst. I mean, the Australian attack at Pozières, in the span of a couple of weeks, they had as many casualties among all the Australian divisions as what they had at Gallipoli in months.
400 dead at Vimy Ridge on April 9th, 1917, the first day of Canada's most famous victory. Germany's worst day of the war in terms of dead was probably the first day of the 1918 Spring Offensive, the Kaiser's Battle, the final German offensive to win the war in March 1918. The Germans had transferred fresh troops from the east after Russia had signed a peace treaty and struck the British near where the British and French sections of the front met. The German plan was to split the Allies apart and crush the BEF, and to do it they used stormtrooper tactics, groups of well-trained infantry who entered British lines and penetrated as far as they could.
Instead of launching a wide, massive kind of human wave assault with thousands of men, you do these infiltration tactics to open up holes in the line and then pour your reinforcements through where the stormtroopers have attacked.
Passing strong points for the regular infantry to mop up. On March 21st, the very first day, the Germans lost about 11,000 men killed in action, most of them well-trained infantry who could not be replaced. German officer...
And why? Why would they do that? They suddenly have a big manpower boost on the Western Front. Well, the Americans are coming. They're coming by the thousands every single day. And, you're going from no Americans in 1917 to something like 1 to 2 million Americans by the middle to the end of 1918. And so the clock is ticking for the Germans. They know it.
Ernst Junger remembered a close call. The attacking waves of infantry bobbed up and down in ghostly lines in the white rolling smoke. Against all expectation, a machine gun rattled at us from the British second line. I and the men with me jumped for a shell hole. A second later, there was a frightful crack. A comrade had a hole through his arm and assured us, groaning, that he had a bullet in his back. We pulled off his uniform and bound him up. The churned up earth showed us that a shrapnel shell had burst at the level of our faces on the edge of the shell hole. It was a wonder we were still alive. Even though at first the Germans made huge gains and created a crisis in Allied command, in the end the offensive failed and was called off 2 weeks later.
I mean, there were a number of offensives. This wasn't just one big offensive. There were a number of them. There's different nicknames for different ones, like Michael and Blucher York. And Georgette was one of them. And the German offensives go from March all the way up until the early part of the summer. That's why you end up with battles like Belleau Wood. That's kind of the tail end of one of the last German offensives of the war on the Western Front. So they did continue on the attack until they were stopped again at the Marne, like they had been in 1914.
For some of the other belligerent states, the totals are harder to estimate due to poor record-keeping or lost archives. For Italy, one contender for the bloodiest day might be the first day of the Battle of Caporetto on October 24, 1917, when Austro-Hungarian and German troops smashed through the Italian army. Or it might have been June 29, 1916, when the Austro-Hungarians launched a phosgene gas attack on Monte San Michele, which killed nearly 3,000 Italians and poisoned 4,000 others, along with some of the Austro-Hungarians themselves. In the end, that attack did not significantly change the front lines in that area. Austria-Hungary's bloodiest single day of the war is hard to pin down given the chaos of some of their early battles. It might have been.
And remember too that nations like Austria-Hungary, this empire, ceased to exist at the end of the war, and so record keeping, which was already not great, becomes even harder when the government that was running the war no longer exists.
It's 1914, when the Habsburg armies rushed into Galicia to attack the Russians, only to be stopped and suffer a crushing defeat by the more numerous and better coordinated Russian armies. Another possibility is February 27, 1915, when the already weakened Austro-Hungarians launched an offensive against Russian positions in the Carpathian Mountains in the dead of winter. On that day alone, the Austro-Hungarian 2nd and 3rd armies reported 40,000 missing, many of whom had been killed in the fighting or died of hypothermia in the snow. A third possibility would be June 4th, 1916, when the Russians began the Brusilov offensive, which ultimately broke the fighting power of the Austrian army.
Yeah, and when we're talking about just casualties in general, there's probably not a day that's going to be worse than what happens for the Russians at Tannenberg, where they basically lose an entire army, but most of those men were captured.
Russian casualty records are also in a state that makes it hard to reconstruct accurate figures. It is possible, though, that the Russian army suffered its worst day during the 1915 Gorlice-Tarnów offensive, when the combined armies of the Central Powers pushed the Russian army out of Poland and inflicted hundreds of thousands of losses.
That doesn't surprise me a bit, because I have something like 10 or 12, I think I have a dozen of them now, German soldiers' funeral cards. These are these little cards, kind of like, today you go to a funeral, they give you a little card that has the details of the person who died in it. They had something like that, and a lot of them have pictures on them, and a number of these German soldier funeral cards I have are men who were killed in this particular battle.
Or maybe it was a day during the intense opening phase of the Brusilov offensive in 1916, but we'll never know for sure. France suffered proportionately greater military losses than any other great power during the First World War, so it's no surprise.
And that's why it drives me nuts when people make jokes about France being quick to surrender, and obviously everybody's saying that because of what happened in World War II, but in World War I, man, they carried the brunt of the casualties and the fighting, for at least on the Western Front.
Surprise that the French army is usually mentioned in discussions of the costliest day.
Yeah.
The war began in 1914 with a frightful 2 months for the French army. Faced with the full might of the Germans and with limited British support due to the small size of the BEF, the French had to bear the brunt of the fighting and of the dying.
Yeah, think about it. You have the German army, who is probably, or almost certainly, the most powerful land army in the world at this point. Not the largest, but definitely the most powerful in terms of the technology and the weaponry and the manpower and the training. This is the most effective ground fighting force in the world at this point. And they're throwing everything they've got at the French, because the whole plan is to knock France out of the war quick before they take on the big Russian bear.
Their plan was to attack the Germans along the border, but these assaults did not go as planned in what became known as the Battle of the Frontiers from August 20th to 23rd. French troops attacked the Germans from Belgium to Alsace, but the larger German armies threw them back as part of their move to encircle Paris, according to the Schlieffen Plan. French soldier Georges Vaux described how his division advanced into devastating German artillery fire. The shooting began to be heard with fury, then faded away. The Germans who'd advanced into the Fosse Plain ran away from our troops. Once they reached the road to Ham, they deployed in long lines of skirmishers and disappeared behind a fold in the terrain. But then the heights on the other side of the Sambre were crowned with lightning. The German artillery attacked. Shrapnel shells burst everywhere on the plain. The French offensive failed at great cost because the Germans were able to bring to bear superior firepower and because the French lacked the artillery ammunition and tactics to overcome the Germans' effective use of their own heavy guns. The single worst day for the French, or for any power, was August 22, 1914, when about 27,000 men were killed. Or so it was thought for many years.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying earlier at the start of this, is that historically that has always been said to be the deadliest day for any army in the First World War. But I've been reading lately a lot of people starting to challenge that. So I'm curious to hear what evidence they're going to propose to challenge that traditional thought process.
As part of the 100th anniversary commemorations of the war in 2014, the French government put the death cards of the 1.4 million French soldiers killed in the war in an online database called Mémoire des Hommes. It was this digitization project that paved the way for a reassessment of the fallen on each day. And thanks in part to the efforts of the online French military history community, we now suspect that the number of dead on August 22, 1914 was probably closer to 21,000.
Which is still insanely bad. But you have to remember that a lot of men were just simply obliterated, or they were killed out in no man's land somewhere and nobody ever got to them. That's why you have literally millions of unknowns in terms of just the walls of the missing and the graves that have unknown soldiers listed in them. You've got over 100,000 men's bones just in the Douaumont ossuary in the Verdun sector. So it's really hard to say who was killed and who was captured and who just went home.
Terrible number, but much lower than previously believed. So if it wasn't the British on July 1st, 1916, and it wasn't the French on August 22nd, 1914,
still say it was the French.
What was the deadliest day? And why did so many soldiers from one single country die on that particular day? One stat that's been clear is that 1915 was the deadliest year of the war for the French army. The British army was growing.
Which is nuts when you think about it. 1915 was the deadliest year for the French. That's before Verdun in 1916. Verdun is what we think of. Like when you think of the French and awful circumstances, Verdun's what I think of. And you go there today and it's just, it's oppressive. Just experiencing the weight of that place. I mean, I've never been anywhere like Verdun when it comes to feeling that.
Until mid-1916, the French were responsible for all the major operations in the West. At the same time, Russia suffered a major defeat in 1915, the Italians made little progress against the Austrians, and the Anglo-French assault on Gallipoli failed. Allied factories were still gearing up production, which meant that artillery and especially shells were in short supply. This meant the French army's task on the Western Front was going to be tough. In May, the French attacked in the northern Artois region, and Moroccan troops briefly seized the crest of Vimy Ridge before losing it again. Throughout the summer, the French launched smaller attacks, according to General Joseph Joffre's idea of nibbling away at the enemy. But the major push would come in the fall. Many Frenchmen had high hopes for the great offensive of September 1915, as did General Joffre in his message to the troops. Soldiers of the Republic, the hour has struck for us to launch an offensive to defeat the enemy. Your élan will be irresistible. It will carry you forward in one initial effort right through the fortified lines which oppose you and up to the enemy battery positions. You will permit them neither rest nor repose until victory has been won.
Optimistic.
The French plan was to break through German lines on either side of the Noyon salient, throw the Germans out of their trenches, and force them to fight in the open. If no breakthrough happened, the French wanted to continue nibbling and wear down the Germans. After 3 days of bombardments against the German lines in Champagne, 500,000 French troops went over the top on September 25, 1915, the beginning of the Second Battle of Champagne. In some areas, French guns had pulverized German defenses, and groups of French infantrymen broke into the lines.
It's pretty cool to hear about the Battle of Champagne. I mean, nothing's cool about any of this. I should use a better phrase to describe it. My first time in Europe, I visited the Western Front and was driving through the Champagne region, and the very first World War I trenches and barbed wire that I ever experienced were in Champagne, up near an ossuary that contains the bones of a number of men who died during the battles in Champagne.
Sous-Lieutenant Jean Duclos was in charge of a machine gun platoon and recalled the start of the attack.
I love these vignettes from soldiers.
The heart tightens at the moment of getting out of the trench. Forced voices shout forward, a burst of energy, and here I am running in the yellow grass, my revolver in my hand. The bayonets are shining all around me. Some German machine guns are cracking. Their bullets are raising small flakes of dust, hitting the ground under our steps, and we are still running.
I try to imagine this when I hear these things described, and it's difficult to imagine some of it. For example, artillery. It's so hard to kind of concentrate on the idea of artillery because we think of artillery as boom, 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 like explosions happening, but the descriptions are more like what they call drum fire artillery, where it's more like boom, 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 boom. Like it's indistinguishable how much artillery would fall on a place at one time. And the machine guns, you know, you think of a lot of like World War II movies where all you hear is machine guns going off nonstop, but it would have been more like brr, 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 you know, short bursts, and there'd be multiples of them, sure, but they were also in the distance, and so you'd be marching across the field and you wouldn't hear this loud, explosive gunfire from these machine guns. You might hear a distant blurt, and the next thing you know, you're dead from a machine gun.
German Corporal Olvad experienced the battle from the opposite perspective. It was soon obvious that gas shells were exploding around us, and we had to react at once. Ignoring the heavy small arms fire, we dashed across to the soldiers' dugout and grabbed for our gas masks. I decided to take 5 men and investigate along the communications trench. We did not get far. Men in blue helmets had closed right up to the dugout and were attacking with hand grenades.
Blue helmets are very distinctly French. They have a very unique design. All of the different armies had pretty distinct helmets that help you to identify them when you see them in pictures, although like Americans, like the Harlem Hellfighters, had French helmets, and so that makes it a little more challenging.
The French managed to break through along a 12-kilometer sector of the front and took thousands of Germans prisoner. Some French units utilized new tactics of fire coordination with artillery, gas, and enhanced reserves to exploit a breakthrough, and a liberal use of hand grenades among the assaulting infantry. Others relied on more dated forms of warfare to try to achieve a breakthrough. The 5th French Hussars received a mistaken report that the infantry in their sector had cleared the German trenches, and they charged the German line at the gallop.
And then this is the way that cavalry, which was still used, especially early in the war before you start seeing the advent of huge numbers of planes and then tanks, especially on the Allied side. But cavalry was seen as a way of exploiting a breach made by the infantry to rapidly send troops through to break the enemy line.
Immediately, the entire column came under heavy machine gun fire, while groups of Germans, looking terrified, came out of the trench with their arms raised. The Hussars jumped to the ground and rushed into the trench. Everything that resisted was shot or knocked out. The 2 machine guns that stopped the progress of the infantry were silenced. Despite the relative success of the first days, the going was difficult and losses were heavy. The 5th Hussars, for example, lost 140 horses in that charge, while the 2nd Zouave Regiment lost 24 officers and 1,100 men killed or wounded, crossing the 200-meter wide no man's land. At the same time that the French went over the top in Champagne, they were also attacking again in Actto. The northern arm of the French offensive in fall 1915 included an assault in the Artois region starting on September 25th, the 3rd Battle of Artois. This time, the British played a supporting role with an attack at Loos. A few hours after the British
Loose,
attack
I've heard
began,
of.
French troops advanced towards
I've
the
heard of
German
Artois, but it's fascinating because we spend so much time when we talk about the First World War focusing on the big battles, the Somme, Verdun, Meuse-Argonne, Kaiserschlacht. We don't think about these massive, incredibly deadly battles that were taking place at other times too.
held strong point of Vimy Ridge in the pouring rain. Even though the British had distracted some German reserves, the French shortage of artillery meant that their attack did not have the firepower to break the German lines. Lieutenant Robert Desoblio's unit advanced over a field covered in corpses from the fighting in the same area in December 1914. He watched as the first wave began to return to French trenches after failing to get into the German trenches. In spite of the bombardment, mines, and trench mortars, there's still wire, that deadly obstacle that cannot be crossed under fire. In front of me, a sergeant collapses, his hands clutching at his stomach. I try to bandage him, but his intestines hang from 2 wounds.
Goodness.
He convulses and rolls in the mud, but his movements soon slow. He cries like a little child. Other wounded men arrive and contemplate the agony of their comrade, but his suffering does not move them. They think only of themselves and how to escape. French troops forced a few breaches in the German lines, but they didn't come close to breaking through or even making it as far as they had in May. General Ferdinand Foch ordered limited French attacks in Artois to continue until mid-October. He didn't want to give the British the impression that the French had given up in the sector, and he felt that scarce munitions had to be conserved for successful operations in Champagne. But the offensive in Champagne did not gain much ground after the penetrations of the first days. Ironically, these limited successes turned into more French dead, since false rumors of a complete breakthrough caused French commanders to feed more and more units into what had become a meat grinder.
That's a great point about how sometimes absolute failure is better in the long term than limited success. Because limited success leads you to feed more men into the meat grinder. It's that sunk cost fallacy. It's, okay, we've put men into this, we're seeing gains, the breakthrough is imminent. Whereas if you launch an attack like the Somme on the first day and it's horribly ineffective for the most part, you're not going to just immediately keep pouring guys into it, though in the case of the Somme, I guess they kind of did keep pouring men into it, but it was mostly in the areas where they were seeing success initially that they poured more men in. You didn't see a lot of follow-up attacks at places like Serre, where it had been absolutely devastatingly turned back right away.
Sous-Lieutenant Duclos is caught up in the slaughter and the confusion in a captured German position. In front of me, invisible enemy machine guns are waking up, and we are flooded with bullets. It's like being surrounded by a swarm of bees. I try to see from where these bullets come from, which kill and wound several soldiers around me. I suddenly feel a violent blow to my face, and my nose starts to bleed. It is a bullet which has just taken off the tip of my nose.
Wow.
Sergeant Welsh, who was on my right, stands at attention, very pale, and asks me for permission to withdraw. He's breathing heavily, having been shot twice in the chest. The senseless insignificance of heroism.
Oh my gosh, that quote is powerful. The senseless insignificance of heroism. Wow, I'm going to remember that one.
Joffre finally called off the Champagne offensive on October 14th. The fall campaign had failed because the French army was not yet able to solve the riddle of trench warfare.
Right.
They could sometimes get into the German trenches, but they couldn't break through them. They lacked heavy artillery and ammunition, struggled with command and control in the fog of war, and they'd not yet refined infantry tactics to minimize their losses. The double offensives in Artois and Champagne helped make 1915 the bloodiest year of the war for France. In those two campaigns, they lost 81,000 wounded and 63,000 killed or missing, and most of the missing were dead. In Artois, the French lost 2,684 killed or wounded for every square kilometer of ground that they gained, an unsustainable hemorrhage. And the bloodiest day of all, for France or for any single state in the First World War, was probably the first day of the double offensive on September 25th, 1915. According to the French Death Cards database on the Mémoire des Hommes website, about 23,000 French troops were killed on that day.
Think about that. That's a day that nobody talks about. Nobody is out there making grand videos about September 25th, 1915, the way that they do about July 1st, 1916, or about the first day of the Battle of Verdun, or the day at the Battle of the Frontiers that we often talk about. This is just such an unremarkable day to most people, but it wasn't for 23,000 families who lost a husband, a brother, a son killed that day.
Not including those mortally wounded who died later.
Right.
That's more deaths than any other day, anywhere, as far as we can tell from the evidence that we have access to today. The Third Battle of Artois and the Second Battle of Champagne don't play a prominent role in the public memory of the First World War, internationally or in France. When we think about the symbolism of the lives lost, we often think of the Somme or Verdun.
Right.
But going beyond the symbols is a critical part of understanding history. The fact that the bloodiest day of the war happened during battles that many of us have never heard of, that don't get made into movies, and that aren't the focus of Armistice Day commemorations, should make us all reflect on how we remember the Great War and the 10 million men whose lives it took.
I'm sensing I'm going to have to do a podcast about this on the stories of the Great War, because this is a story that needs to be told.
The casualty numbers of the First Industrial War of the 20th century were a shock to societies around the world. The Second World War would top these numbers and end with one of the deadliest inventions in human history when the US dropped the newly developed atom bomb over Japan. The other world powers needed to keep up with this development because they understood the strategic implications of such weapons of mass destruction. In the Soviet Union, Stalin accelerated the development of nuclear weapons and also nuclear energy as a whole. If you're interested in the Soviet nuclear program, you should check out the first episode of our new documentary series, Red Atoms.
Oh, interesting. We'll have to check that one out too. All right, that was good stuff. Like I said, check out some of my resources that I have, the podcast, the other YouTube channels. There's a lot more to be learned there. It's all original content, so I hope you enjoyed that. And thanks for watching.